Hello, everyone. My name is Paul. Welcome back to the new news. I apologize for the weird little break between between the transitions there. I needed to get my nicotine inhalation device here. So, with that, I hope that everyone is doing good. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you guys have find that safety security here in the very near future. There's been a ton of stuff that has happened over the last 72 hours. There's been a lot of information coming out from the war in Ukraine, from stuff happening all over Europe, from stuff happening in the Middle East and Africa. And so when it comes to a lot of these things, a lot of it has to do, unfortunately, with a lot of human suffering, which gets a little bit heavy to deal with for when you've been doing this for a while. So hats off to all of you who've continued to watch this stuff. I know it can be kind of depressing to look at the world, but likely what we're here to do is to give back and to help people that are affected by these situations. 100% of everything we do here at the New News is to help people throughout the world. It's to help support charities. 100% of everything we do is for charities. We are never doing super chats or monetizing this for personal gain or doing any kind of merchandising, because we want everything to go towards helping people. That's why in the video description, you're going to find a ton of organizations down there. 70% or more of the donations that they end up receiving go directly to their programs, meaning they go directly to helping people. And with 30% or less, with an emphasis on that or less, being on things like salaries and administration's costs and things that can make some of these organizations controversial, which is why you may not see certain ones down there that we are aware of, but that don't quite meet that criteria. And so I hope that you guys will go and check them out. If you can't give a lot to those organizations, give a little. And if you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. One of the biggest things you can do is help us grow this channel and help us grow our impact. The more people that come here and watch the news, become informed of what's happening in the world around them, the more people that are encouraged, of course, to donate, but the more people will be here to donate, and the more people, of course, that draws that in. So, giving us that like and subscribe and sharing this amongst your friends and communities, that really does help this channel a lot. It's been amazing to watch it grow, from absolutely 0 people to 360, which blows my mind, because I never anticipated on doing YouTube or streams or anything like that. So pretty awesome to see. Thank you everyone for the support, and even more so for the support for those organizations in the description. Now, if you guys are jumping on here and you guys are watching live, please feel free to jump into the live chat. Say hello, ask questions throughout the stream. I'm more than happy to answer questions. 100% of so whenever you're checking out and I am watching the live chat for you guys, hello, JD Redding is always happy to see you. Watch Roku for the most part, so don't participate in the chat. Thanks for the streams. Always happy to be doing the streams. So it's been an amazing thing to do. But if you guys are watching live, don't be afraid to ask questions. I will try to answer them to the very best of my ability. To give you a little bit of a background on myself, if you might be new here, I served in the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020. I served as an O-352 anti-tank missileman and a corporal with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. And during that time, I did 2 deployments to the Middle East. My first tour to the Middle East between October of 2017 and March of 2018. I spent 4.5 months in the country of Syria. I was attached to Special Operations Forces as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. And so during that time, I fought against the Islamic State. And then also I went and was providing supporting efforts, to the SDF partners and stabilization in that northeastern part of Syria. Deir ez-Zor and al-Asaka provinces mostly. Came back to the United States, ran an armory for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and then redeployed back to the Middle East as a Javelin team leader for the Crisis Response Company out of Kuwait between October of 2019 and March of 2020. Went to the Baghdad Embassy complex in New Year's of 2020 as one of the 100 Marines that responded to the embassy compound. We resecured the U.S. Embassy there, and I oversaw all anti-armor operations across the U.S. Baghdad Embassy before about a month and a half later going down to Saudi Arabia and then training Saudi Arabian Marines. I am a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine, but I'm also a fully cross-trained rifleman, a fully cross-trained machine gunner, partially cross-trained radio operator, and a CLS, or a Combat Lifesaver Certified Marine, meaning I've received additional medical training and so I can assist Navy corpsmen, and I do have real-world experience providing aid to actual patients and providing a lot of triage. So I hope that you guys I hope that you guys will be more than happy to answer questions or ask questions. I do have interest in other things, though I'm not an expert. Geopolitics, history, human geography, and science and stuff like that. But I always implore that you, as a viewer, please do your own research. And if you do want a starting point for the research, our website is in the video description below. It's linked down there. And all of these maps, including this one tonight, if you would like to follow along, are listed on there. If we have any additional articles that we may find, we may also put them from other mainstream media sources. And you guys can go and check it out and have a starting point. If you don't, well, of course, you can always look through our sources and go from there. But with that, we immediately run in here and into the news. There's quite a bit of it tonight, of course, as it is 72 hours to cover. But we start off with our special report coming out of the country of Ukraine, if I can get my little cable here untied. And we jump down here and we start off in the capital of Kyiv, where we found out that on, quote, on the night of March 18th, Russian troops attacked Ukraine with 16 Shahed 131, 136 drones. Ukrainian Air Defense Forces shot down 11 of them. End quote. And that's coming from the Air Force Command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. They actually posted this out on a tweet, and it was retweeted also by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. So you guys can go and check that out if you would like. And something that we've seen from the Russians as a tactic is actually the targeting of first responders, unfortunately. So the targeting of first responders is a really big thing for the Russians. It's not just something that we see here in Ukraine, which it has taken quite a heavy toll on them, but it's something that we've also seen long before this. And ever since 2014, we've seen where the Russians have targeted specifically the first responders, such as the White Hats down in Syria. It's been a pretty big issue. Coming from the Ukrainians here, quote, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, Russian troops have killed 68 and injured 201 Ukrainian rescuers. That's coming from Serhiy Kruk, who's the head of State Emergency Service of Ukraine. So when I'm talking about the attacks on the White House, the White Hats, also known as the Syria Civil Defense, they are non-aligned, meaning they don't align themselves with rebel groups or the Assad government or the Russians or anybody. They end up engaging these individuals because the thing is that they have been labeled a terrorist organization by the Russians and by Assad. And so they end up continuing to attack the White Hats when they're pulling people out of the rubble. They're providing medical aid. These are pretty much one of the largest organizations and yet one of the most heavily attacked organizations in Syria. And they are a humanitarian organization, which just blows my mind. I've seen them in action. It's very amazing work that they do. But this is where really the double tap for the Russians, it really comes into play. We see them, they will strike an area, cause a large amount of casualties. The White Hats would move in there, and then the second volley of rockets or artillery shells or the next cluster munition strikes from aircraft would come in and hit the aid workers, and has killed innumerable amounts of civilians and individuals. And the White Hats themselves. Same thing with Ukraine. Though we're seeing double taps. We've reported on double taps actually last year with live footage coming out of Kharkiv during some of those. So pretty terrifying to hear about that. And it is a war crime. It's 100% a war crime to do that. And Tim Emps asks, these are Wagner attacks? Question mark. Yes, in some cases they are. The Wagner Group is really an extension of the Russian military. The Wagner Group was started in 2014 in order to conduct some more clandestine things in the name of the Russians. It started by a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who used to cater for Putin, high-level Russian officials and the Russian military officials. That's how he got his nickname as the Putin's chef. He's part of Putin's inner circle. However, he's kind of had a falling out, and he's having there's been a lot of fighting back and forth between him and Defense Minister Shoigu, possibly because he likely wants Shoigu's job. But anyway, he started this private military organization. It's called the Wagner Group. It's spelled Wagner, but it's Wagner Group. It's pronounced with a V. And they conduct clandestine operations all over the world. And when I say all over the world, I truly do mean it. We actually talk about some of this later. But they are operating heavily in several countries throughout Africa, to include Mali, to include the African Central Republic. The Central African Republic, I apologize, CAR. And then they are operating inside of Syria. They're operating inside of, I believe, Niger and Nigeria and all sorts of places. It's pretty impressive just how widespread. I think they're even in some South American and Latin American countries, so in South and Central America. Very widespread. These guys basically, they serve as contract soldiers in the actual Russian military, whether they were contract or whether they're conscripted and then signed a later contract, or they a lot of them are former Spetsnaz as well, which is part of the VDV forces, but it's the Russian special forces, basically the Green Berets. And they then receive a lucrative contract for Russian terms, considering the ruble's worth nothing. Well, actually, we don't know what it's worth, but they get additional contracts at the end of their contract with the military, and they end up serving as a contractor, as a mercenary or a private military contractor inside of the Wagner Group, which has plausible deniability. This is how you see the attacks on things like Green Village and the Conoco gas plant during 2018, which has American forces, and why there were over 300 Russians being killed. So that is the Wagner Group. Some of these attacks are carried out by the Wagner Group for the plausible deniability. Right now they're supplementing manpower for the Russian military, so they are one and the same, and that's why actually they can't be tried as a mercenary organization if you're fighting on behalf of a nation at war. If you're part of the nation that is at war, I should say. Unfortunately, we do have the solemn duty of reporting the child casualty update. This is something that we see every single time we go live, and it is abysmal every single time we have to report it. But it's important to note. And this one's coming from the press service of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights. And they say, quote, "Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 464 Ukrainian children have been killed and 935 children have been injured. Most victims among children are from the Donetsk region. Moreover, 387 Ukrainian children were reported missing and 16,226 were reported. At the same time, 10,576 Ukrainian children were found and 308 were returned home." And that is the end of the quote. So the forced deportation of children specifically under the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1993 Rome Statute are actually considered to be a crime of genocide. So it is technically the forced deportation of children, the transfer of children from a group to another group, even along national lines, is considered to be an act of genocide against a group of long national or political lines. So it is pretty clear cut in that instance. Now, the United Nations did provide its comprehensive report, mostly in regards to what happened throughout February and March of 2022. And so they requested that further investigations do continue. However, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, did release the fact that they have set out warrants for the arrest of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, as well as Maria Lvova-Belova, who is the commissioner for human rights, or for children's rights inside of Russia, who has been overseeing the forced deportation of children, and those warrants are out there for war crimes in relation to the forced deportation of children. That immediately brings us over here and into the Donetsk region and into the front lines of the Donbass, where the heavy amounts of kinetic activity have been ongoing. That's quite a significant number of shellings, and we're seeing an increased, an uptick in shellings, specifically in the usage of cluster munitions. At least 2 civilians were killed and another 10 were injured after Russian shelling struck the city of Kramatorsk as churchgoers were gathering, with the attack centering on the Bernatsky Park area. Several residential buildings were severely damaged, upwards of almost 20 in fact, as Russian forces reportedly once again struck the city with cluster munitions. Additional shellings of the city have yielded additional damage, but thus far no additional casualties. Coming from Pavel Kolenko, who's the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. We do get these photos coming in here. You can see busted out windows. We're going to go ahead and skip over that one. We can see as well, obviously, you can see the shrapnel points in here. This is not bullet holes; these are shrapnel, little bits of metal that have been released as a part of the explosion from the casing of the explosive.
Вон, дивіться, що руський мир робить. Прилетіло, дуже багато було зривів. З дитиною на пол упали, лежали, поки все закінчиться. Це не передать словами, то, що тут произошло. Ну, прямо гараж прилетіло. Повезло, що в хаті були. На пол попадали. Одно дело, ты пережил это все, а потом последствия психологические и моральные, ну, это очень тяжело, особенно женщинам, детям. И в 14-м выезжали, и сейчас выезжали весной.
Ну, ко мне подъехала вот владелец этой машины, девочка-таксистка Наташа, знакомая. Мы с ней пообщались 5 минут, распрощались буквально. Я дошла только до порога, начались взрывы. Я забежала к дочке в дом, переждали. Я потом вспомнила за эту Наташу, выскочила на улицу. Смотрю, машина разбитая, она лежала под забором, вся в крови. Видно, что осколки на ней были. Она стонала, но была в сознании.
We do continue down here as we flip through more photos of this incident. See a little bit more the outside of that vehicle. That red car really kind of illustrates what they're talking about damage-wise. This is the further continual shelling. This happened today. Once again, additional shelling on the city of Kramatorsk. Luckily, this second incident, did not cause any casualties. And that brings us into the latest daily Donetsk update coming from Pavel Kalenko, the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. He has said, quote, on March 19th, the number of victims of Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 2 injured. And we can pull this up from a graphic from his official Twitter here. And one person was injured in Bakhmut, with an additional being injured in Koshtanivka. Now, so far, since the beginning of the invasion on February the 24th of 2022, 1,418 civilians have thus far been killed, with an additional 3,241 having been injured. Now, this does not take into account areas currently under Russian occupation. This includes areas such as Volnovakha, the city of Donetsk itself, as well as the city of Mariupol, where in Mariupol alone we know tens of thousands have been killed, and that's just based off of an analysis of Maxar satellite footage of grave sites around the city. Speaking of Koshtanivka and talking about cluster munitions usage, 6 people were injured by Russian shelling here. In fact, 1 person was killed with an additional 6 injuries after they continued their stream of indiscriminate bombardments against cities throughout the oblast. So far, reports indicate that Russian forces have been using cluster munitions against the cities in this area at a much more frequent scale now. We're seeing much more... we are seeing many more reports of cluster munitions usage throughout this area over the last several weeks than we have prior. It's not to say that we haven't seen it. We've reported on it several times in the past. But you can just take a look at some of the damage that's been caused here by some of these cluster munitions. This is the canister that's left over. These would airburst over the target, which is why you're going to see a canister like this. When you're seeing these canisters, these are grad rockets that once they got over the target, that grad rocket, it opened up and it dropped a large amount of smaller explosives over a large area. That is the purpose of these cluster munitions, how they dispense, which is why whenever you see these canisters like this, that means that it's an indicator of cluster munitions usage by whoever is utilizing said grad rocket or Ortagon system. There are 122 millimeter Katyushas. But this is some footage of the incident there, and you can see this is what we're talking about by cluster munitions. You'll be able to see it's not a single explosive, a large explosive that has impacted this area. It is a large amount of very small ones. I'm going to get into that here in a moment. See here, unfortunately, it doesn't have any. You can see multiple small explosives going off all around this area. As a rocket came in, it deployed that canister busted apart and ended up dropping, X amount of munitions. You can see them going off there. You know, you can see them where they flash and poof. from the dust and debris. And that is the reality of cluster munitions. Tim Epps says, is that 2,000 or 10,000 cluster? I do not know. I actually don't know the variant of the grenade rocket that is being used for that cluster munition. It's not like the 9S22M, which I have memorized by heart at this point. So it is, we can tell it's a cluster munition based off of how the explosives are going off and the canister that has been left over. But I need to find out the variant of it, the specific name of the variant of it, I should say. DMF says, wow, that's war crimes. It is war crimes. And they're war crimes for not probably the reason you think. Cluster munitions are banned under the Convention for Certain Conventional Weapons in certain cases as well, which was adopted in 1981 with updates since then. And then you also have the Ottawa Convention. The Ottawa Convention bans self-triggering landmines and cluster munitions usage. Now, certain countries are not party to the Ottawa Convention. This includes the United States, the Russian Federation, and the country of Ukraine. Meaning that all of, the United States has cluster munitions in its inventory. The Russians have cluster munitions in inventory, as do the Ukrainians. However, the only country we've seen utilizing them, historically speaking, on any scale or any major scale to be noticeable would be the Russians, using them both throughout throughout the entirety of the Syrian civil war, as well as here in Ukraine. To include the very outset of the war, we saw shellings with cluster munitions in areas throughout Ukraine, especially in the north. So, not to say Ukraine hasn't used them, but it's definitely, historically speaking, it's definitely more in line with something the Russians are going to need to do. The reason why it's a war crime is, even though they are not party to the Ottawa Convention, the indiscriminate shelling of a civilian populace, that doesn't just include the people themselves, but civilian infrastructure includes everything from houses to churches to schools to hospitals to apartment buildings. All of that stuff is protected. And so the indiscriminate nature of cluster munitions and how widespread their destruction can be actually means that they are in violation of, one, the 1949 Geneva Convention, specifically of several different articles within the Additional Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which were adopted in 1977. So it is the fact that it is a indiscriminate munition that does not limit the collateral damage and collateral loss of life to a military objective. And from what it appears, the objective was that civilian population in and of itself. So you can't target civilian populations. You cannot target civilian population centers, meaning cities, with their infrastructure, because infrastructure, including houses, is protected unless being used for military purposes. And even in the 1949 Geneva Convention's Additional Protocol 1, it states if it is considered questionable, if the site, if it is a protected site, a home, a school, whatever, if it is questionable, if it's being used for actual military purposes outside of the realm of treating patients, having children going to school, then it must be treated as if it is being as if it is still protected, unless it can be definitively proven based on circumstances at the time that it is a valid military objective. So even if there's a question, if you have to ask, is it or is it not being used for military usage? Like, there's a lot of guys that seem to hang around there, but there's also a lot of kids that are going to school there. You have to assume that it's still civilian infrastructure unless definitively proven otherwise. We come over here to Chasiv Yar with a little bit of more uplifting news. So all remaining children have been evacuated from the city of Chasiv Yar. Ukrainian authorities evacuated all children from Chasiv Yar to a safer place far from the front lines, according to the head of the military state administration of Chasiv Yar, Serhiy Chaus. A little bit of an interesting thing coming from the trenches around Bakhmut, as people are asking if we are improving Bakhmut, or if we're seeing Bakhmut improve at all. Hello, trench. So, a Ukrainian soldier from the terror unit was in the trenches directing artillery fire when he received a call from the military enlistment office asking him why he's dodging service. Quote, guys, have you lost your mind? I'm in Bakhmut. His buddy ended up responding. We don't have time for this. Just hang up. The call is currently sitting at 1 minute and 40 seconds.
Прилет? Тор! Надо сфоткать коры.
Сфоткай, чтоб не бликовало.
Отдали назад зум. Да. Да. Вы что, ебались, мужики? Мы сейчас под Бахмутом. Быстрее, нахуй. Короче, Тор, бросай на в військкомат, давай фото. Я тут под Бахмут.
Хлопці, а що це за зброя така у вас?
Скари.
So that guy's probably having a pretty shitty day now. Why are you dodging military service? I'm in the front. I'm directing artillery fire. You're preventing me from directing artillery fire. Could you please shut up? So yeah, that's that guy's not particularly happy, I'm sure. Probably also not the guy you want to piss off. But see, people, I just thought it was kind of funny that happened. But as we move into the actual serious part of the conflict here in Bakhmut, we went from taking Bakhmut in 48 hours to being afraid of being surrounded. And that's coming from the Russian point of view. So Prigozhin published an open letter to Shoigu today informing him the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to completely cut off his PMC forces from Bakhmut. He asked for his help to prevent this from negatively affecting this special military operation. Yeah. Not the situation you want to have. And that is because we are seeing a counterattack, supposedly. So there is on and off information about this. I've seen a lot of things happening, a lot of white PRs that are operating in and around this area, supposedly. There's been a lot of kind of smaller offensive operations. The Rasputitsa making that very difficult. The Rasputitsa being the incredibly thick mud of the Eastern European plain, which is literally translates to Sea of Mud in Russian. Quote, Russian occupiers are tactically unable to complete the operation to capture Bakhmut and are suffering huge losses during the fight. That's coming from Serhiy Cherovady, who's a spokesman of the Eastern Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And you can see even the Ukrainian Armed Forces troops going out and hunting down Russian armor.
Какое здание? Ну, это левое, да? Красное, типа? Вот дал нахуй. Следующий, подходите. Хорошо, второй давай. Свои.
All fear the hunter-killer team. And there's also lots of new aid that's being spotted just outside of Bakhmut. So we can see here lots of Humvees. And I do mean a lot of Humvees. We see, these are MAPVs right here. Those are... gotta love those MAPVs. Those are MRAPs. They have the V-shaped hulls. Very survivable. Awesome gun carriers. I used to ride in MAP-Vs pretty often. So we're seeing quite an extensive amount. I think that was a Mastiff actually back there. The last one might have been a Mastiff, but I can't tell for sure. We're seeing all sorts of stuff. So quite a bit of quite a bit of equipment we're seeing. We're seeing quite a bit of fighting. We're seeing obviously a lot of equipment coming into Ukraine right now. Now, as for the actual situation around Bakhmut, we honestly can't determine. So this point right here has been geolocated to being here. Supposedly, right? So that would indicate like a partial encirclement on the southern flank. But we, outside of what we saw in Apatin, we haven't seen anything that definitively shows Russian forces, outside of one small thing that is, located here. We haven't really seen any indicator of Russian troops on the south side of the city, quite to the extent that we have been focusing there on the north. Keep in mind, this map is very general, his front lines, and that's because there is you can't come to me, you can't go to CNN, you can't go to any channel, you can't go anywhere and get the full story, or from any single person. Everyone is getting their bits and pieces, and there's still no way to know. The people on the ground don't know the complete total story. That's the reality. They're focused on their individual parts. So try to keep it relatively general to what we know and what we can identify. So this may not be a great representation as a map. And that's... I like to pride myself on being within 2 miles of accuracy on most things, but still... we do know that there's been significant fighting around the Azov plant. We know that Ukrainian troops retreated across the Bakhmutovka River. We do know that there are troops that are still pouring in. They're getting a lot of reinforcements. However, we have seen quite a significant amount of troops getting bogged down as a result of the Rasputitsa mud, which can make it very, very difficult, because your average everyday paved road is not necessarily meant to handle dozens upon dozens of armored vehicles moving across it with tracks. So that's kind of the situation we're finding there. We just don't have enough information to definitively say there's a counteroffensive, there's not a counteroffensive, it's improved, it hasn't improved. And so to err on the side of caution, we're going to stay as is until we can get definitively more information coming from that front, because that battle is a mess. It's a very complicated mess, and it's a very fluid, ever-evolving situation that it's going to take time to decipher how the movements are actually going. And even then, there's a lot of operational security involved, so I'd rather err on the side of caution there. So I apologize if that doesn't answer your question, but I think it's worth noting. I think it's worth just being honest with it. Coming down here to New York. Yeah, that is correct. New York and Donetsk Oblast. Several residential structures in the city were shelled here in New York. They were damaged as different Russian rockets ended up impacting around the city. Luckily, there were no casualties. However, the roads did take some damage in the shelling, which is, they say, are going to make it difficult for evacuations. This is not particularly a very large village either, so it really doesn't have any military significance here on the front lines. We jump down to Mariupol, where you can ask yourself or not if this is really him, but supposedly Putin ended up getting a very first visit to the occupied territory. After his brief visit to Crimea, Putin has decided to drop by Mariupol under the cover of night to chat with local residents. Most residents have already been debunked, as Putin's entourage and two Mariupol collaborators have already been identified. So that's going well. And this is the original video, by the way, that we're getting ready to show you. This is the original video, which was deleted immediately after publication by Ria Novosti, and the cropped version was already played on TV. A woman can be heard screaming, "Don't believe them, it's all a show," in the background.
Видели.
Чего так надо же начинать знакомиться поближе.
Только мы
Были в Крыму, передали по телевизору. Такая работа, да?
А вы здесь живете или?
Да,
Вот у меня второй этаж, у них первый этаж.
Нравится?
Да, конечно, очень.
Современно.
все хорошо. Я просто единственное, что
Спасибо вам.
видите, Адам у нас, кстати, у меня через 15 дней после вашего дня рождения мое, тоже 70, но остался без ничего.
Теперь
And so you can hear that for 1 minute in the background. Don't believe them, it's all a show. The president, quote, "The president drove through the city like an ordinary citizen," according to Russian propagandist Skabieva, who praised Putin's visit to Mariupol, saying he even stopped at traffic lights. Standards in Russia are very high.
Впервые побывал на новых российских территориях и посетил Мариуполь. В город президент прилетел на вертолете и проехал по Мариуполю за рулем. Как видно на этих кадрах, движение в Мариуполе к приезду Путина не перекрывали. Президент ездил по городу как рядовой гражданин. Стоял на светофоре, пропускал вперед строительную технику. Так Путин...
Just remember pretty much every single stoplight in the city of Mariupol was shot out by Kadyrov fighters there during the Battle of Mariupol. We probably have played, I'd say almost probably 15 or 20 or so videos of Kadyrov fighters during the Battle of Mariupol shooting at empty houses in stoplights. And sometimes the stoplights started shooting back, which is pretty interesting to watch. It blows my mind. And so this is the city of Mariupol from the civilian's perspective. Oh no. Well, that's unfortunate. It appears that someone limited how much I could see. So, unfortunately, we don't get the civilian perspective, though there are plenty out there for y'all if you would like to know. So I apologize for that, guys, but I can't prevent stuff like that. We jump over here and into the southern part of the Kherson Oblast, where it would appear that a collaborator who oversaw the torture in Kherson Oblast has met justice. Serhiy Moskalenko, who helped Russian troops torture Ukrainians in Kherson Oblast, was identified on March 20th by Ukraine's military intelligence as the collaborator who was killed in the March 17th car explosion there in Kherson. In case you're wondering, your car is usually not supposed to look like that. Fair, who is actually our head researcher, said, "I personally don't even think that was the real Putin. This is the fresh facelift Putin, not the wrinkly one." So there has been there's been a lot of talk regarding Putin and his visits, and we've seen quite an extensive amount of people that have gone through prior images of Putin from different visits to different places. And it would appear, and I'm not saying definitively anything one way or the other, but we are seeing some odd things that could suggest Putin using body doubles, which is 100% possible. 100% possible. So it's something I think worth noting here. Being told to check my stuff. Oh, yes. Huh, yes. That's a thing. So JL sent me something, and I'll actually pull it up here for you guys. So this is something I saw, but it didn't quite make a news story in and of itself, but it probably is something worth touching on. So what you're looking at here, this is being dropped by basically Russian quadcopters, similar to how Ukrainians are dropping like grenades and stuff on via the drones, the DJI drones and stuff. And so what this actually is, if you guys don't know, this is required to be carried. This is required by Russian ships to carry. This is a beacon that it's meant to be able to identify ships in distress. It's an emergency beacon, and it can be homed in on with a lot of government equipment. So in order for like searching for people. So the Russians have repurposed this to drop it. It's a maritime beacon in case like your ship sinks or it capsizes or you lose engine and you're starting to take on water or whatever. You can light this beacon, and no matter if the ship goes down or not, this thing's waterproof. You can actually, they can actually home in on it in order to come and find you, or at least find where the ship went down and your location, and start the search pattern from there. That's the point of these. Kind of like the black box in a plane. They're required for the maritime service of the Russian Federation for all civilian vessels. This is a civilian version of this, and because it can be homed in on, the Russians have started to drop them in order to conduct precision strikes, because they can use this and they can drop it right on their target and then bring in an aircraft, or they can bring in artillery and they can bring it in and start zeroing artillery onto it, or the aircraft or whatever, for a precision strike is the point of it. It's very interesting that they're doing this. I've never seen this done before. This is kind of a completely new thing, but yeah, that's a thing that's happening. It's very interesting. We're coming down here and actually into Crimea, where this is at the Zhenskoye airfield. Ukrainian drones finally made their debut here in Crimea. It appears that Ukraine has successfully developed their own version of the Shahed moped drones, which they have made their appearance in the Zhenskoye tonight, or they're in Zhenskoye tonight, striking a train full of caliber cruise missiles. Locals on social media have reported up to 9 audible explosions. The man in the first video is heard saying it landed on the rail tracks. Multiple drones can be heard and following automatic rifle fire, attempting to shoot them down.
Наверное, не увидишь, блядь. Ой, он прямо над нами где-то летит, да? Где-то рядом. Вон он, да. Пытается сбить его. Вон полетел, да, вон. Ой, блядь, он прямо соседи падает, что ли, да? Ёб твою мать. Он прям рядом влупил. Ай-яй-яй, не в дом хоть попал, а? На железку, да, упал?
расстреливают. Дроны гулят по ним, пиздец, блядь, как вокзал на ушах стоит. Сука, днем летит третий, блядь, дом.
Вон там дым, блядь, плохо видно. Дым сверху. Еще. На. Все с вокзала съебывают, хуярить.
And what exactly were calibers doing all the way up in Zhenkui? Well, it's a pretty good explanation on how the rail system here is set up in Crimea. So you can see here they have to be transported all the way up here and then come back down in order to go to places like Sevastopol. So that's why they're all the way up here, is because they're getting ready to transition to go down to Sevastopol, which is Caliber cruise missiles are launched from ships. They're cruise missile. Think the American Tomahawk missile. Kind of the similar idea, but for the Russians. And so this is where the Black Sea Fleet is located. That's where their port is, out of Sevastopol. And so they have to go down all the way to Zhenkui and then back down here into Sevastopol in order to be loaded onto the ships to then be fired at Odessa or wherever. Yep. So a lot of people kind of noting here, you know, I read somewhere that these were made with Chinese parts. Yeah, most things are made with Chinese parts when it comes to the Russians. Real moped drones, yeah, similar design. The design, so Iran isn't particularly advanced in their weapons designs, but they're advanced enough to make them effective, but they also produce them in a cheap enough rate and a large enough quantity to make them relatively cheap for the market for what they're trying to do, which is why the Russians went to the Shahed 131s and 136s to begin with, because they cost significantly less than domestically produced missiles such as the Caliber cruise missile or the Iskander M ballistic missile. See, a couple of people, they're talking about Bakhmut and comparing it with Stalingrad. Bakhmut is less Stalingrad, more Passchendaele. Definitely much more Passchendaele than Stalingrad. If you had to compare any battle to Stalingrad, you would compare probably Mariupol to it. But even then, you get this, you get the idea of the how bad these battles are, and we've even heard people compare it to Stalingrad, the fighting, the bitterness of the fighting. The bitterness of the fighting is there. That mentality, the ideology, that intensity of the fighting is there, but the scale isn't. And I think that's a very important thing to distinguish when we're talking about battles and trying to compare them historically. The battle for Bakhmut is much more Passchendaele than it is really anything else. Passchendaele being Passchendaele Ridge, the battles fought in Passchendaele during World War One. But when you're talking about the Battle of Stalingrad, you can't really compare any battle to the Battle of Stalingrad, rightfully. Stalingrad, also known as Volgograd now, because it sits on the Volga River and de-Stalinization process, after Stalin's death. So the Battle of Stalingrad is hands down the bloodiest battle ever fought in the history of humanity. To give you a comparison in scale, more people died in this single city, in this single battle. More people died in this single battle, the Battle of Stalingrad, than both the United States and the United Kingdom combined during the entirety of World War II. More people died in this single battle, the Battle of Stalingrad, than both the United States and the United Kingdom together. And I'm pretty sure all of the Commonwealth nations of the United Kingdom combined during the entire war of World War II. One battle. The scale of Stalingrad, not the ferocity. The ferocity is there. but the scale is inconceivable of the level of death that happens in the Battle of Stalingrad. Every battle is horrific. Every single battle is horrific. You're talking about a war of attrition. You're talking about sieges. You're talking about mass encirclements. You're talking about massive, massive, massive amounts of fighting going on, and it's very intense, very kinetic, very brutal, very up close and personal, and it's not really something we've seen since World War II, but knowing my age and the age of most of my viewers, you guys, generally speaking, if you're watching this, you probably weren't alive to remember the Battle of Stalingrad, or really the ferocity of World War II in general. So there's not really, when you're trying to think of warfare, a lot of people like to throw out these big name battles, the Battle of Iwo Jima and Stalingrad and things like that, because the thing is that there really isn't anything else to compare it to that would be in the memory of most of us. Most of us have been very fortunate enough to grow up in what was considered up until last year, the longest period of peace in the world, relative peace. Fighting in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the fighting in Syria, all of the civil wars that have happened inside of Africa, all of these events, all of these really horrific wars that we've seen aired on television for all of our lives do not in any way do any kind of meaningful, compare any meaning at all in the scale and destructive intensity of the Second World War. There's just no, you can't compare to that. There is no comparison to that level of destruction. They're all horrific. They're all brutal. They are all savage. And are, without a doubt, the absolute worst of humanity. Many of them, unfortunately, since, in the last 30, 40 years, have also included horrific crimes against humanity. Kosovo, Serbia, Bosnia Herzegovina, basically everyone in the Balkans. That's a completely different. They were horrific, but you can't compare them to the Second World War. You can't compare any battle to really many of the battles of the Second World War. It's just, I think it does an injustice to really just how horrific that is, that we compare to that level. In some ways, yes, but in others, no. Bookham 40 says 20 years ago today was the start of the Iraq War. Wow. I didn't think about that. That is... Woo. Man, that makes me feel old now. Oh, wow. That makes me feel really old now. Ouch. I remember when that started. Oof. Come down here and into the Black Sea, where we see more jet-on-drone action after the recent downing of a American MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Black Sea. One that actually was more hostile to the Russians than the MQ-9 Reaper, the unarmed MQ-9 Reaper drone, was the TB2 Bayraktar drone being piloted by Ukraine, which a Russian jet tried to take down the Bayraktar drone by trying to knock it out of the air via some jet wash, and however, it was unsuccessful this time. Footage from the TB2. I know Right of the Valkyries isn't necessarily. So you can see that Sukhoi Su-27 flanker And you can see it passes in front, and all of that air being forced out the back, is called, that's the jet wash, and it's very dangerous. If you ever seen the movie Top Gun, actually, the original Top Gun from the 80s, the incident, the reason why they go into an unrecoverable flat spin that kills Goose in the movie, spoilers, you had longer than most of us have been alive to watch it. The thing that causes the flat spin in the F-14 Tomcat that they have to eject, and it ends up killing Goose, that is actually because the jet in front of them, Iceman, actually passed in front of them and hit them with jet wash. Very detrimental to aircraft. It's also why it's one of the reasons they ended up kind of flying up and above with one kind of below. Is one of the reasons. There are many reasons that they fly that way, but one of the reasons that they fly kind of staggered is that way they don't get in each other's jet wash. In a little bit brighter news, the grain deal was extended. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was extended for at least an additional 60 days following an extensive UN-brokered negotiations effort there, UN and Turkey. The extension was based on the signing of a memorandum of understanding regarding the UN's additional promotion of Russian food and fertilizer exports, which have been lacking significantly due to significant changes in the market since the war began, as many potential buyers do not want to risk further losses by dealing with Russia. Despite accusations that there were sanctions in place upon Russia regarding food and fertilizer, the United States Department of the Treasury confirms that there's no such sanctions have or do exist. Likewise, food, fertilizer, and medicine are all permitted for trade and shipment. Similarly, Lithuania continues to maintain its rail blockade between mainland Russia and Kaliningrad, which does not impact food, fertilizer, or medicine or other basic needs. Instead, banned materials are those targeted by EU sanctions, which include commodities, luxury goods, construction supplies, electronics, and coal. Coming from the United Nations regarding the grain deal. We can see that here. It was extended on the day it was due to expire. Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually announced that the World Food Program has received at least 30,000 tons of wheat for Kenya and Ethiopia under the Grain from Ukraine program. And there's the EU, that's the UN statement. But this is the press release from 14th of July of 2022 regarding the trade fertilizers. And they actually say here that the Treasury has taken action to broadly expand the agricultural and medical authorizations in Russian-related general license. So not only have they gone out, has the U.S., which is specifically what Russia is really indicating is the U.S. is leading the sanctions and all of this. The U.S. has not only gone out of its way to not target these things because to target these things doesn't fall in line with the UN Charter, if you've ever actually read it. But they've actually gone out of their way to expand the authorizations for general licenses. So people that are trying to get a general license to, move and sell or buy medicine from Russia, or to buy fertilizer or food exports, grain or whatever, is actually easier now than it was before the sanctions were put in place to get a general license to do that as a broker. And so they say specifically, the GL expansion further reiterates that U.S. sanctions on Russia in response to its unprovoked and unjustified war against Ukraine do not stand in the way of agricultural and medical trade. So, once again, you cannot, you can't continue to listen to, well, we're being sanctioned. No one wants to buy from you is the problem. So that's That's kind of the issue there. It's that no one wants to buy from Russia. It's not the fact that they're sanctioned, because the EU doesn't have them sanctioned. If you look at their sanctions list, the EU doesn't have their any food sanctioned, fertilizer or medical sanctioned. The United States doesn't have them sanctioned. There's no country in the world, except maybe Ukraine, because they're stealing the food from Ukraine themselves. You will not see sanctions on any medical trade or any agricultural trade, whether it be actual food product export or whether it would be fertilizer, because there is an international fertilizer shortage. So no one's trying to hold that up, because it's affecting countries like Sri Lanka, which that is one of the root causes of the whole Sri Lanka incident, and why their government, completely collapsed in their economy and their energy sector, because they weren't spending money on they weren't investing in fertilizer for the agricultural industry, which is pretty much the bedrock of civilization. I mean, that's how civilization started, was agriculture. You don't have power if people don't have food. That's generally kind of the rule of thumb. If people are starving, the bread riots in France, leading up to the French Revolution, the increased taxes, which made it more difficult to buy food in the colonies as a result of the French and as a result of the Stamp Act and all of these things, because the British decided to run themselves broke during fighting the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, if you're an American. You can look at so many of these different things. Assad in Syria, on top of the fact it was the Arab Spring at the time. Pretty much every country in, at some point. Russia literally couldn't get food to the troops fighting in World War I. Soviets collapse. Can't afford to spend money on their own people. 1991 rolls around. So it's that's a kind of a leading cause of collapses. But that actually is all of the news coming out of the country of Ukraine. But that's not the only stuff in the world, especially dealing with Ukraine. We got plenty of others in the international news. And we will actually start up here as we jump into Moscow, where, the irony. It is very ironic that European flags have been removed from the European Square in Moscow. Europe Square in Moscow was constructed in 2002 as the part of the Russian-Belgium cooperation project. The Russian government implied the Europe Square would symbolize Russia's aspiration for integration into the European Union. So yes, all European flags were removed from, you guessed it, Europe Square. But tonight's top story also comes out of Moscow, there at the Kremlin, because Xi Jinping and Putin ended up meeting for over 5 hours. The presidents of China and Russia met in Moscow and talked behind closed doors. After several press engagements, leaders talked privately for nearly 5 continuous hours. And while no official announcements have thus far been made regarding what agreements were made throughout their discussion, many are speculating it may be of a proposed Chinese-brokered ceasefire negotiations with Ukraine.
Уважаемый господин председатель, дорогой друг, добро пожаловать в Россию, в Москву.
I'm sure there's an axis of evil joke that I could probably throw in there, but I really don't feel like it this late in the evening. Coming up to St. Petersburg, censorship in Russia is now beyond rationality, even for the Russians, and that's kind of difficult. This young man was arrested for his poster with a famous Soviet cartoon character, who is well known for his phrase, "Guys like all get along." Yep, a Soviet cartoon. And as someone has already asked in the chat, getting a little bit ahead of themselves. A B-52 Stratofortress was intercepted by Russian jets in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. An American B-52 Stratofortress was intercepted by Russian aircraft and escorted into Estonian airspace from international waters in the Baltic Sea shortly after it lost its Polish F-16 fighter escort. So Polish F-16s were spotted escorting this B-52 Stratofortress. However, they turned back and headed back to home, back to their airfields, where almost immediately the F-15, the Russian aircraft then intercepted the B-52. Coming from the Russian aircraft here. Just remember, while it may not necessarily be needed, the B-52 was designed with a tail gunner. In fact, I don't know if we can get a good... we might get a better photo of the... Oh, I completely exited out of that. So, you can see here, good view of the B-52. So, the B-52 is actually old enough. I don't know if you can see it back here. There's a section back here. This very lonely cockpit area. There's actually no good way to get to the rest of the through the rest of the aircraft and into this section. Can we zoom in here? That right there, you can see where it's kind of flattened off there at the end. That is because the B-52 Stratofortress, when it was designed in the 50s, and clear up through Vietnam, actually, had a tail gun. Just like the aircraft that came before, the B-29, Super Fortress, Flying Fortress, the Liberator, the Mitchells, all of them had tail guns, basing it off of World War II designs. Except the thing about the tail gun on the B-52 is the facts that they were removed, but they had miniguns in the back of them as the tail gun. So yeah, so it should, in case you're ever wondering, I am all 100% for the B-52 regaining its tail gun. Because could you imagine trying to intercept a B-52 with a tail gun on it? With like a 180-degree arc? It's pretty wild. They got a pretty good arc to them. Or 90-degree arc. Yeah. Good luck trying to get on like the 8 o'clock position. I wonder if we will start escorting more craft in that area. They did have an escort. They did, like I said, they had Polish F-16s, which were providing fighter escort for them. And once the F-16s returned to base, or began their return to base, the Russian aircraft immediately swooped in to intercept the B-52. Jump over here and into the United Kingdom, where 9 nations are now training Ukrainian troops in the UK alone. UK, Sweden, Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, New Zealand, Lithuania, Australia, Norway, and Finland have all come together to train Ukrainian troops there in the side of the United Kingdom thus far. Yeah. Quite a diverse amount of instructors and a lot of experience out of that too. Having a very diverse amount of instructors can be very, very interesting. And it can make for some very good training because you have different perspectives on how to do different things. The UK is training Ukrainian troops on how to fight using Leopard 2 tanks, as well as the Challengers, with courses for the commander, the gunner, and the driver and operator. The United Kingdom has pledged to donate 14 Challenger 2 tanks and related ammunition to support Ukraine in the ongoing battle. These are Challenger 2s here. You can identify them by their very powerful optic suite on top of the gun, as well as several other features that aren't really worth noting here.
Course is really to give the Ukrainian crews the best amount of knowledge we can within the restricted amount of time we've got, noting that they need to get back to start fighting again. And it's designed to give them a firm foundation in how to fight the tank and how to live off the tank as well. We've done 4 separate courses, similar to that which we do in the UK, courses for the commander, the gunner, the driver and the operator. And at the end of the sort of the technical training, so learning which button does what and how to make the gun fire, we'll do a consolidation package which will allow them to work together as a crew for the first time, fire the tank on ranges, and then they'll be ready to go on to a bit more tactical training in the form of simulators, and then they'll return to the Ukraine to marry up with the vehicles that the British government is giving them.
Arch Instinct says, can B-52 tail guns have Stinger missiles, though? No. But yeah, Challenger tank training, more training is going to be ongoing, and we're going to see significantly more of that going forward, especially considering there's been a lot of videos coming out of the training on the Leopards coming out of Spain and all sorts of stuff. But to answer your question, Arch, can B-52 tail guns have Stinger missiles, though? The answer is no, and it's for a very fundamental reason. It's called backblast. Backblast is hot gases that are expelled out the back of the tube when a missile is fired. And this goes for rockets as well, so the AT-4s, the LAWs, the RPG-26s, the RPG-7s. These things, they expel a massive amount of hot gas out the back of it, and it's very deadly, especially the closer you are to it, and it kicks up rocks and all sorts of stuff. When you fire, this is something that makes it difficult to fire rockets indoors. That's why I kind of shudder a little bit whenever I see someone firing a rocket inside of a building, because it bounces off of everything. That gas will literally and turn your insides basically into mush. The overpressure. It's very, very dangerous, very, very deadly, and it's a consideration you should always have. Anti-air missiles are going to have that too, just because of the nature of how they shoot them, just how the nature of how these things fire. The seals have arrived in their natural habitat. And the U.S. Department of Defense released some vivid images of SEALs performing an exercise with a U.S. Navy nuclear-powered guided missile submarine off of the coast of Greece. You see there, they are rappelling out of a CV-22 Osprey, which you can see there, aka the Flying Coffin. Gotta love the SEALs. Of course, they are special operators, so you got to blur out their faces. It's kind of a cool training exercise. You don't get to see SEALs doing SEAL things very often. You know, especially when you're talking about very often doing like counterinsurgency and stuff. So always good to see the guys going and getting it. I don't think these are the guys that I worked with, though. Unfortunately. the guys I worked with were a little bit. Yeah, they're not the same guys. Oh well. So a lot of really cool photos coming out of that. Now, it's just kind of a cool thing. You're seeing a lot of military training ongoing here all throughout Europe for forces as they are kind of they're there. You don't send troops somewhere and to have them do absolutely nothing. It's a complete waste, and so you're constantly wanting to get them some training, and so and keep them prepared and keep them in the mindset, especially given the tensions in Europe right now. With a wrong move could send a lot of things going very badly for a lot of people. So having a lot of troops there, having them prepared and coming and continuing to, and allowing them to, continue working, continue preparing for that's pretty sweet. Preparing for that possibility. Delta Aviation asked, did you hear that the EU signed a 155mm artillery shell deal for Ukraine? I have heard that they proposed to produce 1 million shells. However, outside of the proposal, I'm not tracking it was signed. Coming from Azerbaijan, tensions are running high once again as large movements of Armenian and Azerbaijani military forces have been spotted tonight. Some Telegram accounts from the region are suggesting some sort of conflict may be brewing.
Onlar nədir ki, hara gedir ki, qardaş? Hara gedirlər ki, ora? Onlar hara gedir ki, o burada? Bu var, 3 bu boyda kolon keçdi bəyəm. Allah eləməsin, yəni müharibə zad başlayar, yəni müharibə zad başlayar. Çəkdim, olar mən.
You can see here more military convoys on the move. That last one was a little bit more difficult, but you can see all of the lights, all basically the police, beacons that they were going off as they're continuing to move forces. Both sides being in a constant state of war. Secretary Antony Blinken's statement about the situation said, quote, I spoke to Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan today to reiterate U.S. commitment to helping Armenia and Azerbaijan reach a sustainable peace. Diplomacy is the only way to peace in the South Caucasus. And Bookham 40 asked, what side are we supposed to be on? Who's the good guys here? To be honest, I don't know. Because it looks like Russia supports both sides and has been playing both sides to an extent. And personally, I do understand that there's a lot of tension between the two. There's a lot of ground and a lot of terrible things that have happened to the civilians there. And we've covered a lot of that. But I do not know enough about the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict to tell you. When that really kicked off, I was actually, if I remember correctly, when that was really kicking off and there was a huge amount of troops that were fighting each other right there, I was in, I want to say either Kuwait or Iraq, and I kind of had other things I was focused on at the time. So I was seeing it on CNN, kind of in passing, going into the chow hall, whatever, but not necessarily the thing on the forefront of my mind, I don't think, at the time. And so I just have never followed it closely like I have other major conflicts, like, the growing tensions between Turkey and Greece, and the tensions between Syria and Israel and Palestine, and Iran, Iraq, Syria, basically this whole region, as well as what's been going on in Eastern Europe and China, and then their immediate neighbors too. So I don't really track very closely. I apologize. Down here in the UAE, quote, it's time for Syrians to return to their Arab family. Syrian President, end quote. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was welcomed for an official UAE visit by President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The trip by Assad comes after a visit to Oman last month.
واشتقنا لكم فحان الوقت أن سوريا ترجع إلى محيطها العربي إلى إخوانها العرب.
Obviously, it's just a big promotion video. You can see a photo reel coming from the UAE. Bashar al-Assad is the last Ba'athist dictator of the Middle East. For those that don't know, he is a Ba'athist. He's part of the Ba'ath Party. If you know who the Ba'ath Party are, the Ba'athists were who was in charge of Iraq prior to Saddam Hussein getting kicked out of power. In fact, the U.S. has a headquarters in the old Ba'ath Party headquarters known as Union 3. Right across from the embassy. Arch Instinct says, you think the Middle East will form into a new caliphate? No. No. I don't think so. The too many differences, especially religious. Arch Instinct says Saudi Arabia made peace with Iran. Real big quotations on made peace. Iran and Saudi Arabia, and I've talked about this before, Iran and Saudi Arabia are polar opposites when it comes to their sect of Islam. One is Sunni, one is Shia. They have been going at it for a very long time. They are both in the extreme of their religious ideology, with both of them being somewhat of a theocracy. I'd say Iran more definitive, with the supreme leader, also known as the Ayatollah, who is Khamenei. And they have been vying for power for a very long time over who has influence in the Middle East, especially following the loss of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which really released kind of, it opened a vacuum. And so that's not the only thing. The Iranians have very openly but unofficially been supplying the Houthi rebels in Yemen for a very long time now, for years now in that war. And Saudi Arabia is the one that is sending its troops, its actual troops, to fight against Houthi rebels in Yemen. So they have been fighting against each other in a very brutal war for quite a while now. Thousands have been killed, all of it based off of essentially religious lines. And same thing with Iraq. You go into Iraq and you have the government, the government which was just supported by Saudi Arabia is also backed by the United States because those ties are there. But the Iranians are the ones that have been trying to overthrow the Iraqi government, specifically through Muqtada al-Sadr, who runs the Mahdi army, which technically doesn't exist anymore, but he also runs the peace brigades. They're not peaceful because they're very much armed. And he is also very heavily supported by the other parts of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMFs, inside of the country of Iraq, specifically Kataib Hezbollah, which is part of the wider Hezbollah network. But it's mostly Iranian-trained fighters, and many of them were actually fighting in the insurgencies there in Iraq against U.S. forces and coalition partners. So they are constantly trying to overthrow the Iraqi government, sometimes by force, and that's like the whole Iraq stream that we did that one time when things were really, really kicking off in Baghdad. That was 100% Muqtada al-Sadr behind that. Whereas, Saudi Arabia is more or less leaning on more of the official side of things. Iran is doing much more clandestine things, funneling fighters on the M1, which is, if you look here, Route 1 runs all the way from Iran through like Basra, essentially. Comes through Basra, goes all the way up into Baghdad, and continues out from Baghdad, clear over by Jordan, which is right here, country of Jordan, and right into, you guessed it, into Syria, where it becomes Highway 2. And so when you're looking at this is how Iran funnels fighters from Iran all the way through Syria into Baghdad, all the way through here and into Syria, which is one of the reasons why the U.S. has troops in Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, because guess what's near Basra? It's Kuwait. Also, it makes a great staging base. And also, you guessed it, Jordan. There's troops in Jordan, which has been noted before. The reason for this is because of its proximity to the M1, the ability to observe them from the M1 and report on troop movements of Iranian fighters. When I was in Syria, it was estimated that 70,000 Iranian fighters were in Syria. With Bahrain and stuff like Bahrain, Qatar, and all that fun stuff being here for the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf for weapon smuggling. So it's not a simple sign a piece of paper deal, is really what I'm getting at. There's a lot of stuff that is happening. A lot of it is kind of abrupt, which really makes me question things. Like the Iran Saudi Arabia deal, peace deal, whatever. I've read it and I've heard about it, and it is a very, very big thing of news. But there's not enough detail about any of it to say that anything is actually going to change. And there hasn't been any concrete things yet outside of some phone calls and some statements. There hasn't been anything concrete to say it's something lasting and not just a show of, not just for publicity's sake. Delta Aviation keeps telling me that he sent something in the Discord regarding the signing of the deal. EDA's project provides a framework for countries to jointly procure urgently needed ammunition for Ukraine. Yep. EU did agree to a $2 billion euro ammunition plan for Ukraine. Coming from AFP News. Pull up the European Defense Agency here. Big signatories. It's pretty sweet. More ammunition for Ukraine. We have jumped down here and into Africa now, and we jump over here into, unfortunately, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is coming out of Lubero and the North Kivu province, where an additional 10 people were killed in the latest Islamic State attack. There were additional photos, but they were a little bit too graphic. The incident occurred on the 19th of March in Lubero. It is noted that the first MTO attack that occurred outside of its usual area of activity. So they're starting to kind of expand out. And, of course, we can see the Islamic State flag there. A very distinct flag. There are other groups that use it. Boko Haram uses a very similar one, but they're not the same. They all have the seal of the Prophet on it, but it's not the same. Coming up here into the Central African Republic, as I was telling you earlier, we have some possible Wagner news coming out of here. 9 Chinese workers were killed in the Central African Republic, as namely they were miners. They killed in an attack by unknown militants. The incident occurred on the March 19th in the city of Bambari, located northeast of the capital. The government and the Coalition of Patriots for Change, or CBC movement, declared their non-involvement in the incident. The latter accusing, with the CPC accusing the Russian Wagner group of the incident. The head of the PRC is calling for the punishment of the killers. And that is their official statement. You can see one of the burned out vehicles here. Once again, there were photos of this. It was very brutal. Not something I feel is necessary to show on stream to illustrate what's going on. We jump over here and into Miami, where there will be a long road to recovery for some. And that number, unfortunately, continues to increase as every day of fighting in Ukraine goes on. But in the summer of last year, the paratrooper Mikhailo Evarovich was seriously injured while on duty in Ukraine. Even though Mikhailo is just starting his rehabilitation and lessons on walking with his new prosthetic legs, you can see genuine happiness when he's able to make it across the parking lot to his wife. And if anyone happens to be curious about Mikhailo's story, his interview with English subtitles is available on YouTube as well. Last story of the night comes out of Washington, D.C. $350 million military aid package for Ukraine has been announced tonight. An additional $350 million USD worth of military aid was announced by the United States and the Department of Defense, which includes a variety of ammunition to sustain Ukraine's military on Western weapon systems, as well as optics and mine clearing equipment and other maintenance support. You can see here coming out from the U.S. Department of Defense for their immediate release tonight. Ammunition for HIMARS, or high mobility artillery rocket systems, 155 millimeter artillery rounds, 25 millimeter ammunition that will be specific to the Bushmaster, which is used by the Stryker and by the Bradley. Sorry, I couldn't think of the name for a second. High-speed anti-radiation missiles, or HARM missiles, for targeting radar. 81 millimeter and 60 millimeter mortar systems and mortar rounds. Gotta love 81s. Skatey ones. AT-4 anti-armor weapon systems. Wonderful to see. AT-4 is very effective as a medium or as a light anti-armor weapon system. Grenade launcher, small arms, and associated ammunition. That will be very miscellaneous, but we can safely assume it's probably AR-15 platforms with 203s. Or I should say M16 platforms with 203s. Demolition munitions and equipment for obstacle clearing, which will become very important as they are looking at a large-scale offensive here in spring, and many of these have defensive positions set up. Mine clearing equipment, as we've already seen and talked about very heavily, is the fact that a lot of this stuff is, how do I say this? A lot of Ukraine is already covered in unexploded munitions, and so it's going to be very important going forward in clearing this stuff out. Heavy fuel tankers, we already saw some of these there in Poland, and so it was assumed that these were going to be coming out. These are the large HEMTT trucks that have the fuel tankers on the back. Thermal imagery systems, optics, and laser rangefinders, always happy to see. Riverine patrol boats, that's going to be very helpful for things like the Dnipro River. Testing and diagnostic equipment for support, vehicle maintenance, and repair. You got to make sure you maintain this equipment. This stuff is expected to break, yes, at some point, but prolonging that makes things very, very cheap in war. Especially if you can prevent as much maintenance, or if you can prevent as much destruction of your equipment as possible before it gets to the battlefield. Spare parts and other field equipment, of course, continuing that need for maintenance. This comes from everything. From tires to tire engines. I mean, it's pretty extensive, whatever the parts are going to be. Remember, everything that is designed, especially by the United States, everything that's designed by the United States, generally speaking, for warfare, is supposed to be field. It can be fixed in the field, essentially. It should be readily fixable in the field or at a nearby field depot. So the way the United States has always designed its vehicles, especially when it comes to the Sherman, really developing that level of logistics during World War II and the immediate afterward. The engine of an Abrams tank, it's a jet engine. The exhaust coming out the back of it 600 degrees. It's absolutely horrific. Please never walk behind. Never walk behind an Abrams. It's a terrible. You will regret your life decisions, your life choices. And so the thing with the Abrams is that you can take out that whole engine. You can get a field crane in there. If they can bring you a crane and an engine, you can take out the whole engine, the whole wrecked engine, out of the back of the tank, and then drop in the new engine, and you can have it in a crew, just the crew of the tank, and a maintenance crew will make this faster, but the crew of the tank can actually swap out engines in about 3 hours. As long as they have a replacement engine on hand in a crane, they can swap out the engines in about 3 hours or less. It's quite remarkable, and everything is designed to be able to do that, especially on American equipment, because when America has to usually fight a war, I don't know if you noticed, Big Ocean 1, Big Ocean 2 between us and whatever we typically are going to fight at. So everything, whatever you're sending to Europe or to Asia, has to be fixable in the field, because it's not coming back. It's not, if a Leopard gets damaged in Ukraine severely enough, they can send it back to Germany, back to the factory, and Rheinmetall can switch out the guns, and whoever can switch out, the Bundeswehr can switch out the tracks and whatever, right? Or for Russia, if they, get a very damaged vehicle, they can send it back to their tank factory in Vladivostok. The United States can't do that. The tank factory is in Lima, Ohio. It's not happening. It's way too expensive. So everything has to be, to an extent, replaceable in the field, or something that can be completely written off as a battlefield loss. And that goes for the Humvee, that goes for the MRAPs and MAPVs, that goes for tanks and Bradleys and Strikers and LEV, everything. Has to be easily repairable in the field. And there's things to do that. There's whole armored, the Quadcon shipping containers. There's armored versions of that for armories to do in the field. Have armories in the field and ammunition depots in the field that are armored and protected and locked and secured properly. It's amazing what can be done. So, but that is everything on the news tonight, at least from our sources. We hope that you guys didn't necessarily find this enjoyable, but found it very informative. And I hope that you guys will be back to join us once again on Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central, for another 48 hours of news and review. And in the meantime, I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. Please be sure to check out the video description and check out all of the wonderful organizations in the description below, and help support people in dire need all across the world. And if you can't give a lot to those organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. Help us expand our reach by giving us a like and subscribe and sharing this amongst your friends and family and communities. So hopefully that we can continue to grow this channel, continue to grow this project, and continue to try and help as many people around the world as can through the work that we do here. So in the meantime, I hope to see you guys once again back here on Wednesday for another night in news and review. My name is Paul from the New News, and have a great one, everybody. Bye now.
Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стояду вам на ваги, чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлейфуйло. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стрія до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям плечом, даже танки и бачок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стрія до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your top 11, shove it up your wrinkled bomb. I will come and help you fit it in your skull.
Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стрія до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стрія до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стрія до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стрія до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Ідіть нахуй.